Hello, everyone. So my name is Damian Williams. I'm the CTO and CISO of N3 Hub. So what I'll be talking to you all about today is around how do we balance personalization and privacy in this world of ours that we live in. I've been working in digital marketing since 2012, and I currently work for N3 Hub since about 2015. So we operate, we're a marketing operations service provider and CDP vendor with offices in both Australia and Auckland, New Zealand. And we operate with enterprises across both those countries to help them have more timely and relevant conversations with their customers directly through the use of data. So we'll kick off with just a brief overview of what is personalization. And it seems like an obvious question to us all being marketers. But when you drill down into it, it's tailoring the experiences that you present to individuals to meet the unique set of unique requirements and expectations. And that can be everything from personalizing an email with someone's first name through to what you see there with content being switched out depending on someone's gender or other preferences, to something really advanced, like what you see with Spotify with their daily mixes or their auto-generated recommendations. And so it covers a vast swath of techniques and technologies. And personalization is very popular. So, and increasingly popular. These statistics that I have here have all been gathered relatively recently over the last few years. So we've got a situation now where nearly 2/3 of customers actually will only respond to personalized messages, and that about 80% of customers are actually expecting brands to engage with them on a highly personalized level with relevant content to them. And also also expecting customers, about half of customers expecting brands to be able to anticipate their needs even before they engage with them directly in a relationship. So that extends out into their the lead nurturing phase, into the paid media. But it's still, given all that, the majority of people say that companies still send them offers that aren't relevant to them or communicate with them about things that aren't relevant. So what we have here is a picture of consumers who are increasingly demanding high levels of personalization in the interactions they have with brands. The flip side to that is, obviously, is privacy. So privacy is a very broad subject and covers a variety of things. But what we'll focus on here today is really around privacy within a marketing context. So within that, it's how an individual expects the data that they share with a brand, either directly or indirectly, through either signing up directly for something or when they're monitored behaviorally through analytics, how that data, that information is going to be handled and then used by that organization. And that really, these days, revolves around this idea of this equitable exchange, where individuals are happy to provide information to a brand organization to use, as long as they get something in return for that. So it's very important. But even if they do get a return for that, even if there is an equitable exchange that happens there, they expect that information to be handled in a very securely and to be used in ways that they've consented to, and that they understand what they've consented to. So those are very key things about privacy in this day and age. So what we're seeing now is that even though personalization is very popular, privacy is actually becoming just as popular. So as you can see here, 3/4 of people feel that they've lost control of their data, and they're not happy about that. And the vast majority of Americans consider it important to be able to control who can access their data on an individual basis. And 2/3 of people are more concerned about online privacy than they've ever been before. And then, as you can see, in 2019, there was a vast increase in the number of people who are concerned about internet privacy. But still, customers are prepared to share, the majority of customers are prepared to share information in exchange for personalized experiences or for some other exchange, whether that's ad-free services or relevant communications from an organization or a brand. So we find ourselves in a situation where customers or consumers do want personalization. It's very effective. I think we all understand that the more you can personalize an experience with an individual, the better the outcome will be for both the organization and the individual themselves. But they are wary of handing that data over unless they feel it's going to be looked after appropriately, and whether there is a equitable exchange for that data that they provide. So, how have we got to the situation? How have we got to this position where everyone, organizations, individuals want personalization, understand the benefits of it, but yet they are wary about handing that data over? Well, it all comes down to basically the high-profile data breaches and examples of personalization has gone incorrect or has not gone well. And that extends to everything from individuals' experiences with a brand where they potentially have received an irrelevant communication from them, or they've opted out and still received communications from them, or they didn't even know how they signed up to something and they're receiving experiences from a particular brand that's tailored to them or tries to be tailored to them without them giving consent. So those are sort of micro examples of where personalization gone wrong, and that spreads over social media and through word of mouth. So it becomes the dominant narrative. And then in parallel that, you've got these situations where you get these large data breaches or scandals where data has been used in ways that individuals didn't explicitly consent to. So that's ranging from things like Cambridge Analytica to the various data breaches that are there. So you've got the Yahoo one from 2013 where 3 billion records, it came out over a long period of time, had been breached or being made available through various means. Alibaba in 2019 with 1 billion records compromised. LinkedIn in 2021 with 700 million. And then Weibo with 538 million. So it's across the board where customers are increasingly seeing these their data being used in experiences that aren't necessarily what they signed up to or don't necessarily reflect their unique requirements. And then in parallel to that, we've got this idea where data is like flowing freely out from organizations that they've entrusted it with. So that's created this situation where even though people want personalization, they're not confident about handing the data over to those organizations, either because they feel that the equitable exchange isn't there, or they don't feel as though that organization is going to be can be trusted with that information. So what reaction has that generated through both the public and the private sector? Well, governments have reacted through the enaction of legislation to enforce the private sector and public sector bodies to better control how they acquire data, how they store it, and what they use it for. And so the biggest one, obviously, is GDPR from the EU, 2018, followed closely by CPPA, the American version. And then you have more Asia-Pacific versions, APPI from Japan, PIPA from South Korea, and the Privacy Act in New Zealand, which have, to one degree or other, equivalency with the GDPR. And the equivalency with GDPR, on a legislative point of view, is important because it enables data to be exported but from the EU to those equivalent jurisdictions, which means you can deal with European or EU citizen data, which has economic benefits and benefits for those organizations. So we've seen these, and that's not an exhaustive list. There's a vast variety of legislation being enacted throughout the world in order to encourage or to enforce organizations to be able to take better care of the data that individuals trust with them. But it hasn't all been, the reaction hasn't all been driven from the top down from government organizations. Business and technology and the private sector itself has reacted directly. Some view it as a threat to their business model. Others see it as a clear differentiator in the market for them. So you see Apple very much taking that perspective where, since 2017, they've had ITP, which has been allowing for, third-party cookie blocking within their browsers that they create. You've seen Firefox very much getting onto the same, jumping onto the same bandwagon, if you like, in terms of cookie blocking. You've seen the rise of things like DuckDuckGo and Brave, which are very privacy-centric alternatives to more mainstream search engines and browsers. And you've seen Microsoft with the Edge browser also going to third-party cookie blocking, and then belatedly Google with Chrome also making a roadmap in order to the blocking of that. So you're seeing public pressure and legislative pressure pushing those technology businesses to take privacy more seriously than probably they may have overtly in the past. So we're in a unique situation right now where we have a strong desire from both organizations and individuals for personalization. But personalization, in order to do it effectively, requires a good amount of data and generally quite sensitive data, individual level data. But on the other side, you've got governments, businesses, and individuals demanding high levels of privacy. So we're in a situation in digital marketing where we need to find some way of balancing those somewhat diametrically opposed requirements. And this is what I mean by two masters, is that our consumers and our stakeholders increasingly want more personalization. But on the other hand, wider society and technology is driving towards greater levels of privacy. So how do we achieve a balance? How can we achieve good levels of privacy as well as the level of personalization that people are becoming to expect? So the way you can, the way that we like to think of it, or I like to think of it, is by adopting an appropriate risk-based personalization approach. And I can see three of those. There's the conservative approach, the balanced approach, and the high-risk approach. So the conservative approach is really where there's no tolerance for reputational risk, and where compliance cost isn't that high due to the nature of the business, and there's no tolerance for regulatory risk. And this is really what you'll see in a lot of government organizations or health providers, where there is the risk of a data breach or personalization going wrong is so high that they avoid doing it. So really the idea is that you only gather data and use it for the purposes, for service-based purposes. You don't use it for excessive personalization of experiences that aren't related directly to your relationship with an individual. The reason for that is because of the high cost of risk for those organizations. And the downside to that, obviously, is that there's low levels of personalization within those organizations. They will personalize to an extent, but because they're either due to the sensitivity of the data they deal with, their high public profile, or through the services they offer to citizens, they basically have to avoid personalization because they can't use it, seem to be mishandling their data or misusing it in a way that isn't directly related to the services they're trying to deliver or the communication they're trying to make to those individuals. So generally you end up with lower engagement, lower customer satisfaction, but that is offset by the fact that there's a low chance of things going wrong, and it builds up a high level of trust in those brands and those organizations. So it's not something you typically see in a lot of private sector businesses outside health and things like that. But it is certainly a valid approach for businesses that have very low appetites for risk. The balanced approach is one that is probably more familiar to everybody. And in this case, there's good levels of personalization, which results in good engagement because information can actually, data can be gathered with accurate consent information, is handled well, and can be used for personalization within those organizations. And so one of the things to see these organizations is they try and take a balance between the risk and the reward of personalization. So they try and gather as much data as is considered reasonable for the sector that they operate in from their customers, to make it very clear what the data is going to be used for, how it's going to be held. And then they will use that data to drive their personalized experiences. And what you'll see here is there's generally low regulatory risk because they try to follow all the relevant legislation, that applies to them in the areas they operate in. And there's low reputational risk because they're trying to follow best practices and the legislative requirements. The downside to this approach, obviously, is there can be high compliance costs because you need to be very careful about what you're about how you're gathering data, how you're storing it, what you're using it for, how you're handling it, and that can lead to slower experience delivery. So the experience delivery may not be as fast as as it could be because there's a lot more checks that you need to go through and make sure that you're using only the data you need for the experience that you're going to deliver, and that you're complying with both legislative and internal processes and internal regulations. But generally, you'll find this in most organizations that will try and take a balanced approach. They don't want to get offside with the regulators. They don't want to be perceived as being playing fast and loose with people's data. But they still want to achieve a good level of personalization or offer a good level of personalization to their customers. So the flip side to those ones is the high risk approach. This is where there's high levels of personalization and potentially high levels of engagement, but without having to worry about the compliance costs. So in organizations such as this, data is gathered from wherever it's available and it is used to drive any experience you want to, with very few rules and controls put in place. And this can be an approach that works for early stage businesses where they have, not so concerned about reputational risk or regulatory risk because they're a small size organization or the early stage, and so if their reputation is bad, it's not that there isn't such a big impact on them because there isn't that sort of brand asset value that they have at the moment. And there can be big rewards there if you get the data, use it, deliver those really compelling experiences to your users without necessarily following all the rules and that you should, or that you have been directed to, or the best practices. You can get to you can achieve scale quickly. And then the idea is that you can move to a balanced approach after you've reached a certain scale where that makes sense. So obviously this comes with very high reputational risk and high regulatory risk. So so what happens here is that if you do get it wrong, then you can be fined, or there can be all sorts of adverse impacts, whether that's a negative social media reaction to your brand or your offering. And so it's not something I personally would recommend, but I can certainly see where organizations may weigh up the risk versus reward and decide to take the risk to do this, and it's personally valid. So then we come into what actually works best for your organization. So it depends on your organization's appetite for risk, and it doesn't necessarily have to be something that is fixed in stone. What you may find in organizations is there may be some parts of the organization that may take a very conservative approach to the use of personalization, whether that's segmented by brand or by product. And then you may find other parts of the organization, whether that's a subsidiary brand, or whether it's a subsidiary, or whether that's another product, which may decide to take a high risk approach because that early stage, it's separated enough from the main business that you actually can take that sort of approach. Or you may find that certain events, you may take a high risk approach in order to be able to get engagement with customers. And we've seen that in the pandemic, where organizations with a physical presence, when they've been forced to move increasingly online to continue their business, they've adopted a high risk approach. In a sense, they want to keep engaging with their customers, but they can't do that on using their physical mediums. So they go and they transition very rapidly to digital, and then they accept the fact there's going to be some risk in that because they don't necessarily have clean data or they don't handle it correctly and things like that. So and then they will move to a more balanced or conservative approach once they've reached some sort of steady state. So it's not something you, as I said before, you need to make a hard and fast decision about, but it's something I believe you have to consciously be thinking about all the time. And so what is the risk-based personalization approach that we're going to take in this organization based on our risk appetite. But regardless, I think this sort of cycle is something that should be followed, irrespective of the approach you try to take. And what this is, this life cycle is basically you sit down, you try to understand what do you want to achieve with your personalized experiences. What is are you trying to increase revenue? Are you trying to improve your relationships? Are you trying to improve your reputation? Or are you trying to improve retention? The 4 R's. What are you trying to achieve with your personalized experiences? Once you've done that, then you can look and say, well, what sort of data what's the data I need in order to be able to deliver those sorts of experiences? How do I, what do I need? And if you're taking a conservative or even a balanced approach, you look at that as basically the minimum viable data set that you need. If you're taking a high risk approach or in the upper end of the balanced approach, you may look at trying to grab as much data, get as much data as you possibly can. So once you've identified the experiences that you want, then what you need to do is determine the data you need. Then you need to develop how your programs, how you're going to collect that data and how you're going to manage that. So it's a very important phase. Is that a lot of people will focus on their data gathering and how I'm going to acquire the data to drive my personalized experiences to achieve my outcomes, but they don't necessarily focus so much on the data management side of it, which is quite key. Once you've sort of developed that program, then you need to design a robust ability for people to be able to manage that data, both internally and for your customers to be able to do that, which means things such as your opt-outs, how do they correct that data? So that's one of the things that's kind of quite clear in a lot of legislation, is it's not just about giving people the ability to opt in and understand what they're opting into and also then to opt out again. It also it gives people the right to be able to correct their data. So data management is beyond just and data correction and data accuracy is something that you need to allow individuals to do either directly or indirectly. So you need to figure out, so you need to design a robust way of providing that. Then you move to implementation phase. So you implement your program, get your personalization experience live, acquire the data, build the experiences, deliver the experiences, and then measure. And then importantly, you need to validate to make sure that everything's working as well as it can be. So making sure that you are following all the processes that you've laid out for the handling of data and personalization, and make sure that your data management is accurate. And then, of course, you repeat, because as I said before, this isn't a set in stone thing where you make the decision once and you move on. You'd be constantly looking back and understanding whether your personalization program is actually meeting your business requirements, and then make sure that you're collecting the right data. Because one of the things that organizations will do is they'll often gather a large amount of data early on, and then over time they realize they're using a small fragment of it. But they'll keep gathering that larger set of data even though they don't need to. And so one of the things I always encourage organizations to do is to go back and to revisit the data that they're acquiring and make sure it's all fit for purpose, and to not gather and dispose of, where appropriate, any data they don't need anymore. But this life cycle for building up your risk-based personalization program will apply no matter what risk-based approach you take. And by following this thing, it enables you to be able to better understand where you're introducing risks into your organization. I mean, I'm always a fan of being a CISO, I'm always a fan of minimizing risk wherever possible. So depending, irrespective of whether you take a high risk or a balanced or a conservative approach to your personalization program, there are things you can do to minimize risk irrespective. So you should always make it clear to individuals what data you're asking for, and why you're gathering that data and what you're going to use it for. Then you need to make it very easy for those individuals to be able to opt out or to be able to correct that data. So those are two things you can always do. So even if you're being high risk and you get as much data as you possibly can, and deliver as wide a range of personalized experiences as you can, irrespective of how creepy it is, then you still need to, I still would advise that you make it very easy for people to be able to opt out or correct that data, or to be able to fine tune the preferences, even if they can't necessarily opt out fully. Given the ability to opt out of the vast majority of the personalization that you are presenting to them. Know the law and the regulations that apply to you, and it's important to understand it's not just the laws and regulations of the country that you operate in or you're incorporated in, but it's also around where you're gathering data in. So one of the things that was a cornerstone of the GDPR was the fact that even if you operate in a different jurisdiction to the EU, if you're gathering data about EU citizens, then you're covered by the GDPR. So it's very important that you're aware of all, where you're operating, where you're getting data, and what jurisdictions you're getting data in, so that you understand your risk and try and comply as much as possible with those various laws. A lot of our clients, for instance, will just not communicate with people in the EU because it's the risk is too high for them. And only gather what you need, the data you need. As I said before, by getting too much data, you're potentially, once the data is there, and if you're not intending to use it for personalized experiences, it's very easy for people to then put experiences live that utilize that data, and then you may be going beyond what individuals are consented to. You may have said you're going to use this information only for these purposes, service-based messaging. Then you start using it in marketing messaging. Then you start running into problems as individuals saying, "Why are you using that information? How are you determining that I need to get this experience?" And then, as I said before, it's very vital to remove what you no longer need. Don't keep data just because you might need it for a rainy day. Remove the data. You can always go back and ask for it again. You may not always be successful in getting that information, but it's in my mind, it's always better to reduce your data set to match what you're using and what you need, rather than keeping that the risk of having that data that may potentially go stale or may potentially be misused or mishandled when you actually don't need it. That makes life a whole lot easier and a lot less stressful. So one of the things about personalisation is that personalisation is very data-driven, as I said before, and it requires a lot of quite individual level data to do personalisation well. Aggregated data sets aren't, things such as cohorts or segments of people that are anonymised aren't necessarily always going to deliver the sort of personalised experiences that are going to engage customers. So that leads you to a data management challenge. How do you manage data, this sort of level of sensitive information, in a way that's going to enable you to drive personalized experiences to the level of risk that you're prepared to accept? So the things you need to consider is personalization data needs to be securely held, and it needs to be as accurate as you possibly can make it. So keep it accurate. So you shouldn't let records go stale. You should re-engage with your customers, will make it easy for them to be able to update their information. And you want it to be available. You don't want a situation where experiences go live without the data they require being available for them, because that will lead to poor outcomes for everybody. And one of the important things is making sure that the data is traceable. So you know where the data that using personalization comes from, the source systems, so you can actually trace back and see where any issues may have been introduced into the system. So it's data management is a vital part. It's, you've got your data, and then data management are the two foundations for any personalization program in my mind. A lot of people will think it's generally data. I get the data. Once I've got the data, personalization will flow from that. But the missing piece often people we deal with is the data management side of it, and not realizing that once they have the data, they have to look after it. However, data management is easier said than done. It's not just about someone being responsible for looking after all the various spreadsheets and things like that. The main challenges we see in the organizations that we deal with is data silos, where data is spread across organizations. The data needed by personalization doesn't sit in one place. So you have to go and fetch data from a variety of different places, which means keeping it accurate and in sync is very difficult. So therefore, the chances of something going wrong go much higher. You see a lot of complex MarTech stacks. So you see a lot of organizations where they've got a separate, quite often channel-specific platforms. They've got a platform doing SMS, another one doing email, some proprietary thing for in-branch e-commerce thing over here, and things like that. So it's quite complex to be able. So you've got all this data coming from multiple different sources, and you've got to distribute it across potentially a wide variety of stacks. And even if people are using a largely homogeneous stack from a single vendor, sometimes because that is the product of acquisitions, talking to that stack may be just as difficult as talking to a stack made of multiple different platforms from different vendors. What we also generally find is there's low marketing priority for data resources. So when someone actually wants to go and get data to use for personalized experiences, they may not necessarily be the ones that are high on the list of priorities for that team to actually go and execute that request and make it available. So it can take a while for marketing to get the data they need to drive those experiences. So the chances of the data becoming out of date or stale is quite high. Typically, marketing departments or experience departments lack data skills. So they lack the ability to be able to go and fetch the data themselves, to go and manipulate it into the format that they need it to be to drive their marketing stacks. And then you have, and so that's always been sort of like something that's held back marketing departments, traditionally. Then another one, you have inconsistent channel priorities where you've got experiences differing on a per channel basis. So you may find that there's a particular experience going out on an SMS channel, but your website personalization is running a completely different set of experiences, driving a completely different message. And then you have your email channel doing something completely different as well. So it's very difficult to get consistency of communication. And so what you end up with is confused messaging going out, and then confused consumers at the other end that then get message fatigue, and then being unsure of what you're trying to communicate with them about, decide not to act on any of them. Rather than acting on all of them, they'll just act on none. It's always easy for someone to do nothing than just to do multiple things. And another important one is distributed consent management. So what we have also found in organizations is that there may be the SMS platform getting the SMS consents and push notification consents sitting inside the push networks. And then you have your email consents sitting somewhere completely different. And then drawing that one picture of all those consistent consents and can be very difficult, which means that the risk of someone sending out a experience to someone who has opted out of another channel when they thought they were opting out of everything is an unhappy consumer and a potential breach of local legislation and things like that. So it's one of those things where, from a brand perspective, you want to communicate with as many people as possible. So the temptation is to have very channel-specific opt-outs and consent, so that an individual opt-out on an individual channel basis. But from a consumer perspective, they believe they're opting out of the entire brand, and so, or the entire brand's communication. And so there's that sort of, you either make it very clear that they're opting out on a channel basis or opting out of everything. And that's one of the things we always run into organizations. Our advice is always to try and be a bit broader when it comes to opt-outs, because the risk and the consequences of not being so can be quite high, depending on the country you operate in. But generally, having this distributor one has that risk, but also the fact you don't have a single picture of what channels are opted out of most, or what channels are more effective and things like that, because you've got the distributed consent model. So, given all those challenges, how can you solve for that? So, one of the things that have happened over probably the last 5 to 7 years in digital marketing is the rise of customer data platforms, or CDPs. And so what CDPs do is they try and bring together all the data within an organization into a single customer view, and then make it available to other platforms to use to drive experiences. So they create a single customer view. So they've sometimes evolved out of the DMP side of the world, other times the analytics side of the world, or other times from an integration side of the world, or from a data platform side of the world. So you end up with these customer data platforms, and they can really help reduce the experience data management burden on an organization, regardless of the risk approach that's taken. They do this by creating that single customer view, which removes the need for, which means that you've got your data all centralized nicely in a single place. So that removes the need for custom-matic integrations. Someone be having to go and manipulate the data to make it match the platforms you're trying to push it to. By having a centralized view and a CDP with segmentation capabilities, and you can then segment the data consistently across channels. So one of the things that we like to see in CDPs is where a single segment can be shared across multiple different platforms at the same time. So you're not having to create a separate channel a segment per channel. You've got a single segment and you're sharing across multiple channels. That way you get the consistency of communication. And then you can also centralize the supporting personalization data. So good CDPs not only just bring in a single view of customer, but they bring in a single view of personalization data as well. So that if you're supporting data to go along with your experience, such as relevant products, offers, account holdings and things like that. And information can be centralized alongside your CDP to be able to and be made more readily available to your personalization, your experience delivery platforms to deliver better personalized outcomes. And then one of the other big things about it is that by centralizing it and having these integrations, you get this really good audit trail and this traceability into how your data is being sourced, how it's being segmented, and where it's being shared to. So when something does go wrong, which inevitably will go wrong, just because it happens, you can actually go back and see where the issue arose. Was it in the source system? Was it in the segmentation rules? Was it in the integration side of things? So you're not having to chase around and try and engage with multiple different people to try and figure out what's gone wrong. Becomes a lot easier. So the other things you can get through a CDP in terms of being able to get a better handle on your data management and be able to better understand what data you have and what you can do with it is through the visibility of available data. So by having it centralized, you then have the ability to have a single view of all the data available for personalization, and you don't have to go chasing around different teams and digging into different data silos to see what you potentially could use. The idea is that once you define what data is available or should be used for personalization, you make it available in the CDP, and then that becomes the definitive record of what you should be able to use for personalization. The other thing is you can then have enforcement of data access rules. So you can actually say, okay, only certain business units can access this set of data that's residing in the CDP, in this part of the CDP, or you can only use this data for these sorts of segments. As I said before, consistency of communication can be enforced. Also, through that data access rule, you can then prevent unauthorized data source usage. So you can actually say, okay, only data that's in CDP can be used for personalization. Therefore, there's no temptation or no ability for people to actually go and upload random spreadsheets of data into platforms to be able to, put the experience live, which means you've got a much better control, a much better handle on what data is being used for personalization. And as I said before, which I think is really vital and what a lot of people sort of miss is this ability to trace issues back to source data. Be able to say, okay, there's the information here. This information was wrong. This information was sourced from here, so therefore go directly back to the source system and say, okay, that data was wrong that came to us, or there was something wrong with the integration in between. So it does make life a whole lot easier when you're actually trying to diagnose and debug issues. So N3 Hub, as a CDP vendor, we've developed our own CDP coming out of the financial services sector. So we've got a very, as you probably tell, very strong focus on risk management, data management, and traceability and auditability. So one of the things you'll find in our CDP is we've got a built-in compliance center, which enables you to have enforceable rules that apply at a segment basis, so that segments can't be created that can work around particular rules you put in place, exclusions or inclusions. The ability to actually generate arbitrary feeds from the centralized data that's stored in there. So the CDP itself, our CDP not only centralizes customer data, but also centralizes personalization data. So therefore, you can actually generate supporting feeds for your personalization, your personalized experiences. So you've got this one-stop shop for all the data you require for personalization. Very strong coming out of financial services sector. Very strong focus on auditability. So you can actually go through and see segment membership and segment rules, when they were exported, how many people were in there, who was in that segment at a given point in time. We also have the ability to have segments that will persist in time. So you share a segment, and that segment's membership will be fixed in time. So you can always go back and see who was in that segment. So if anything goes wrong, you can actually see whether that person was targeted or not. Strong integration capabilities. We're agnostic to marketing platform, so we will integrate with anything and take data from anywhere. We have a strong focus on a light touch integration approach, so we'll take the data as it is rather than trying to enforce an interface on people. And then consolidation of data, being able to remove duplicates and create a single customer view, and then be able to distribute segments and multiple different channels. A single segment to multiple different channels rather than having per segment channels. So we're all about giving our customers the confidence to personalize and saying, okay, all the data is centralized in one place. The consents are managed here. Everything is managed in this one place here. There's good traceability, auditability, and rules around what people can do with that data. And so you've got a much higher degree of confidence, irrespective of the risk-based approach you're taking, in order to be able to personalize. So to sum up, I believe you can serve both masters. You can deliver compelling, timely, relevant, personalized experiences to your customers, and still respect their privacy and still make sure that you're handling their data in the agreed way and providing them with that sort of equitable value exchange. The main thing is that you need to understand your risk appetite for the organization in order to achieve this. So you need to understand just how far are you prepared to go. And that may depend on the jurisdictions you operate in. It may depend on the state life cycle of your business. It may depend on your capabilities internally. But if you understand your risk appetite, then you know what you're getting yourself in for, and you can understand what the potential outcomes are, both positive and negative. Build solid foundations. So as I said before, the key foundations for any personalization program, irrespective of risk model, is data and data management. So data management without data is not going to achieve anything for personalization program. And the flip side, data without data management is also not going to achieve the outcomes that you want. You need both in order to build that really solid foundation to drive whatever personalization program you wish to, that your risk appetite will allow you to run. I believe that in order to achieve that, the most efficient, economical way possible is to centralize that in a CDP, which are dedicated marketing data platforms designed for this purpose, to ease that burden of management and integration. And lastly, by no means least, know the laws and regulations of the jurisdictions you operate in and gather data in. So that's the key thing. It's not just about where you operate in, it's where you gather data from. And so that's the end of the slideshow. So are there any questions?
So first question I've got, and I want to go back to, and this actually, I'm going to kind of paraphrase from the audience's question. Define, if you will, a little bit further what you mean by risk appetite.
It's basically how much reputational and regulatory risk is your organization prepared to take on in order to be able to achieve your personalization objectives.
Okay. Yeah. So one of the struggles, I think, that for any global brand and Asian Pacific markets, where you're marketing very often to other countries in that general area, every country has its own set of data standards. You mentioned GDPR and you mentioned CCPA. I'm here in the States, and although California's protection agreement has been sort of the flag agreement that's made everybody, run in one direction, one of the fears that a lot of people have is that there are going to be 49 other states that will have their own, and there's a lot of legislation going on now in Virginia and Florida, and each of those have a little bit different stance. So, but for the most part, they're still following under, a general consensus together. When you have countries in so many varied markets, Australia, India, Japan, Singapore, Korea, they each have very unique and different data laws. How does the marketer, what's your advice to the marketers, how they can approach that? Because the way we personalize data for generally, say, the US, all 50 states are going to be the same. But Europe takes as a continent, almost basically takes the same sort of cultural stance on personalization. But India doesn't look at things the same way Japan does versus Singapore and so on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think what you're seeing now is the heft of the GDPR comes into place, is that if a country wants to do data business with the EU, they have to have an equivalent jurisdiction to the EU. So you generally see a lot of the privacy acts, the privacy laws that are coming into place generally follow maybe not in terms of the same terminology, but the general principles are generally followed. So really it's the idea of only gather the data you need and make sure the consent is informed consent when people are giving you data, and it's clear what you're going to use it for, and give people the ability to opt out and to modify that data. Those are really the principles. So you stick to those principles. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not giving you legal advice, but generally you won't go too far wrong, because you're seeing a lot of, because those are the principles that really underpin the EU, the EU's GDPR, and businesses, countries kind of being forced to toe that line anyway, because otherwise you're cutting out a large section of affluent consumers. So I think you're going to see a lot more of that, and a lot of jurisdictions are trying to achieve that equivalency with the GDPR. So I think if you stick to those principles that outline the GDPR at a high level, then you're probably going to be pretty right in most jurisdictions. And I think where you see the differences on a jurisdiction basis comes with unique regulations, really around language or particular legal requirements for things like how long the statute limitations are for particular laws and things like that, how long you should keep data for and stuff like that. So that can be a bit trickier, but I think that kind of doesn't necessarily fall into the marketer's concern basket. I think if they're sticking to those overall principles outlined in the GDPR and they're not too different to what's in CPPA, then you won't go too far wrong.
Well, I know that's going to make your job incredibly complex, navigating, setting up all those standards within a great product like yours. So another question we had from the audience, let me read this because I'm going to kind of paraphrase this a little bit, is with respect to data source, how do the people, and again, I worked in big data and I've worked on the brand side and seen people not understand their data. So when you talked about that earlier, not having enough marketers to understand the data, it was music to my ears because I remember it too well. How does a modern digital marketer start learning more about data so that they can put together a better set of data in a product that gets ingested into your system so that I, as a marketer, can go and act on that data later?
So I think the fact that you're asking that question is you made the first steps. So I think what you find is that marketers who don't even ask that question, who believe that data is something that doesn't exist to them, that's really where the alarm bells go for me. But I think the main thing is to try and distinguish understanding data at a conceptual level from the actual detail of actually going and operating on data. So I think a lot of people will go straight from going, oh, marketers should learn SQL or something like that, or learn all about relational databases in order to be able to access data. And I think it's a bridge too far. I think marketers will start by looking at the data from conceptual level, like how is data organized? What are tables? How is data linked together and things like that? Understand at a really conceptual level, and then once you have that, you'll probably be able to answer some like 2/3 of your own questions. And once you understand the conceptual, you'll have really good, and then you'll be able to have much more peer-to-peer conversations with data teams within an organization, and make a lot more forward progress. And then only if you're, you get really interested, then you can dive down into the SQL level. But I think where I've seen it go wrong was when marketers have gone straight off and said, okay, I'm going to learn SQL, and I'll have the data skills that I need, and it's like, and then they just get, it's too much. They need to take a step back and find that intermediary sort of introduction to data concepts, not the whole 9 yards of trying to become a data engineer.
One other question, I know you're in Auckland. Is the market for hiring people in that part of the world who have a good concept of data? Because this is a problem in pretty much every market I've seen when you're trying to hire a sophisticated digital marketer, especially one that is used to working with data. Finding a data scientist is nearly requires a miracle most of the time. But how do you find the market in your part of the world for, getting the right kind of people that understand data to help support you and your efforts?
Well, I mean, there's two sides there. One's the sort of engineers we have, not how to build the product and to deliver our services, and then there's marketers in general.
Sure.
It's probably worse here in New Zealand because the market isn't very big. It's a country of about 5 million people, so you can get away without necessarily, no one's got vast data sets. So generally, everyone's kind of, you can sort of get away with traditional sort of brand marketing techniques, a lot of word of mouth, small country, very small degree of separation between people. So it's worse here. The marketers have been able to sort of bury their head in the sand for a long time around data and stuff like that. So I would say at a global level, the digital marketers here would be probably underskilled as
Mhm.
opposed to what you'd find elsewhere in the world. In terms of software engineers, reasonably well serviced, but in terms of software engineers and marketing operation, marketing automation people, generally what we find is they don't come with a marketing background. They generally come from somewhere else, whether that's maths, stats, or something else like that. And we have to train them on digital marketing and understand the problem domain. So it's generally here. And we're kind of lucky because we've got access to the Australian market as well. So we've got teams in
Mhm.
Australia, so we can sort of augment anything in New Zealand. But it's not easy in Australia either.
Yeah.
Better than New Zealand, obviously, but still not
Well, the
a
good
lot
news
of growth.
is well, the good news is COVID hasn't affected New Zealand like it has most of the rest of the world. So, God willing, everybody will continue to be safe and well there. Damien, that was a fantastic presentation. I really, really appreciate your time today, and I want to wish you the absolute very best.